5,000 soldiers. That was the number Assimi Goïta was handed the moment he became president of a brand new alliance nobody had seen coming. After Niger's transition completed, the trio, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, came together and formed something entirely new. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, and Goïta wasn't just a member. He was named its president, and his very first assignment was almost impossible to picture succeeding. Build a joint fighting force from 3 separate national armies, 3 separate supply chains, 3 separate command traditions, 5,000 troops combat ready, in a region where every mile of ground was already contested. Sadio Camara, still leading Mali's defense ministry, worked hand in hand with his counterparts across Niger and Burkina Faso. The planning began in 2024. By December 2025, right before the AES summit convened in Bamako, they delivered 5,000 troops, equipped, trained, and ready to operate across borders that insurgents had been crossing freely for over a decade, while national armies stayed locked inside their own territory. The force was headquartered in Niamey, Niger, and placed under the command of a Malian-born officer, Brigadier General Daouda Traore. Air power, shared intelligence, coordinated ground operations, all pulled together under a single structure for the first time in the region's history.
The formal establishment of the Confederation on July 6, 2024 in Niamey, and immediately the various ministers of defense and chiefs of general staff got to work. Initially, officers of the Legion were deployed in the different countries to coordinate the various operations to ultimately achieve a truly unified and cohesive force, because when you carefully look at the comprehensive agenda of the Confederation, it becomes clear that Mali was specifically tasked with diligently working on the establishment and full implementation of this essential unified force. So there was then a comprehensive training phase with extensive tactical exercises meticulously held in Niamey, the capital city, as well as in various other significant Sahel states and regions. Togo and Chad also participated. So that was the beginning of the ramp-up phase.
And then something remarkable happened. When Ibrahim Traoré took over the presidency of the AES, the growth didn't slow down, it accelerated. By April 2026, that 5,000-strong joint force had nearly tripled, 15,000 troops. Read that number again and remember where this story started. Soldiers training with wooden rifles because a regional arms convention made real weapons nearly impossible to import in time. In the space of a few short years, that same region produced a 15,000-strong cross-border multinational fighting force, built almost entirely without the 2 institutions that were supposed to be responsible for regional security in the first place. ECOWAS, the African Union, both organizations, decades older than the AES, neither of them had ever produced a standing joint army of their own. Plenty of speeches, plenty of declarations, never boots on the ground moving across borders together. The AES simply built it and moved past both institutions in the process. There's a detail in how this force operates that deserves real attention. The 3 countries deliberately began purchasing similar weapon systems, aligning their equipment so operations could run smoothly across borders instead of 3 militaries trying to coordinate with 3 completely different arsenals. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This force isn't being trained by outside instructors flown in from a foreign power. It's trained by local instructors, Sahelian soldiers, teaching Sahelian soldiers, keeping tactics, doctrine, and hard-earned battlefield knowledge inside the region instead of handing it to an outside power that could walk away at any moment. The message embedded in that decision is impossible to miss. This alliance wasn't interested in trading one dependency for another, and the momentum kept pulling in more partners. Other African nations, Togo and Chad among them, joined portions of the joint training operations, extending the reach of this new security model beyond just the original 3 founding states. Inside the force itself, entirely new kinds of units began to emerge, built specifically for the brutal terrain these soldiers actually have to fight in. One of the most striking examples came out of Mali, a unit built around motorcycles, soldiers on bikes engineered to respond faster than any armored convoy could manage, cutting across terrain where heavy vehicles simply can't follow. This was one of Sadio Camara's signature projects, a unit designed to move where the enemy assumed no one could reach them. Camara described the thinking behind it plainly. security threats keep evolving, and an army that doesn't evolve with them gets left behind. Motorcycles adapted for rough terrain. Rapid response as the entire design philosophy, protecting civilians and territorial integrity by simply being faster than anything the insurgents had ever had to face before. It was innovation born directly out of necessity. No massive defense budget behind it. Just a clear-eyed read of the terrain and a willingness to build something the old playbook never imagined. And this force, this 15,000-strong alliance moving across borders, trained by its own people, equipped through partnerships built on the AES's own terms, didn't stop growing in isolation. Because behind every one of those 15,000 soldiers stood a supply chain, weapons flowing in from multiple directions at once, reshaping who actually holds influence across West Africa's security landscape. And that supply chain is where this story turns global. 3 countries, ranked among the most dangerous places on earth to live. And right now, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, they are building one of the most capable armies on the entire African continent, while most of the world isn't even watching.
In a few days, the major chapter should be ready for the first major operations. The force needs to have its means of action. If it decides to intervene somewhere, it will do so with all its resources. And so, for example, in this area, we are quickly strengthening capabilities, because when we talk about capabilities, we need autonomous power. And that's very important. So we need that, and to put it into operation for very large-scale operations across the entire area. So that's an important task.
For decades, Africa's security systems were built to stay weak, not by accident, by design. And for a long time, that design didn't seem to matter. Before 2010, insecurity across the continent wasn't the crisis it is today. Then, in less than a single decade, everything changed. Armed groups rose in one country, and within years, the fire had jumped every border around it. The nations built with the weakest defenses were about to face the deadliest enemy any of them had ever seen. Some of these countries were still training soldiers with wooden guns. Real weapons were tangled in regional import restrictions that could take months to clear. Restrictions written by a regional bloc more focused on preventing illegal arms flows than on letting legitimate governments defend their own people. And when the crisis finally hit, one country went first. Mali. Rewind to 2011. Libya. Muammar Gaddafi's government falls, and with it, an entire ecosystem of Tuareg fighters who had spent years fighting under his command suddenly find themselves without a patron, without a paycheck, and with a truck full of weapons. They came home. Home in this case meant northern Mali, and what they brought with them wasn't just firepower. It was fury and a willingness to ally with religiously affiliated armed groups who had their own plans for the region. Together they moved on the Malian government, and the Malian army, stretched thin, poorly equipped, with almost nothing to fight back with, could not hold the line. The country came within reach of total collapse. France stepped in. Operation Serval, then Operation Barkhane, pushed the immediate threat back. But pushing an enemy back is not the same as building an army capable of standing on its own. Mali was still weak, and everyone, including the people inside Mali, knew it. In 2020, a colonel named Assimi Goïta led a transition of power that reshaped the country's direction entirely. Almost immediately, the walls closed in. ECOWAS suspended Mali. The African Union followed. Every conventional channel for acquiring modern weapons slammed shut at once. At this exact moment, Mali sat among the most insecure nations on the planet, and the traditional Western partners who might once have supplied it simply refused. So Goïta looked elsewhere. He turned west to Russia. He turned east to China. He opened a channel to Turkey. China in particular treated Mali as a priority, moving weapons in with a speed that Western bureaucracy had never offered. And standing beside Goïta through all of it was a man who would become one of the most important figures in this entire story. His childhood friend, a soldier he had served beside for decades, Sadio Camara. Together, the two of them began completely rebuilding the Malian armed forces from the ground up. Not patching, rebuilding. And what they built didn't stay contained inside Mali's own borders. Because watching from next door, in Burkina Faso, a young captain was paying very close attention. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, and within months, he would lead a movement of his own, removing a fellow officer, Paul Henry Damiba, from power after growing convinced the man had lost focus on the security crisis consuming the country. Traore didn't build his approach from scratch. He looked at what Assimi Goïta had already done next door, and he made his first move as head of state count. He traveled to Bamako and spent 3 hours in direct conversation with Goïta himself. 3 hours, leader to leader, soldier to soldier. A crash course in exactly how a nation locked out of the traditional arms pipeline finds a way back in. And it worked, because within a year, a nearly identical story would repeat itself. In 2023, insecurity finally reached Niger, the third pillar of what would soon become something none of these 3 countries could have built alone. A coup took place there too. And with it, the final piece was in position for something no one in the region had ever attempted at this scale. Because Traore, just like Goïta before him, was already running straight into the exact same wall. ECOWAS restrictions on arms movement, Western governments unwilling to sell. He took the same road Mali had already carved, China, Russia, Turkey, for the drones that would soon reshape the skies over the Sahel. 3 countries, 3 nearly identical stories, 3 governments locked out of the system that was supposed to protect them, forced instead to build something entirely their own. And what came next would turn 3 isolated national struggles into a single unified force the rest of the world is only now beginning to reckon with. Because this wasn't going to stop at 3 separate armies training in 3 separate capitals. This was about to become one alliance, one command structure, one force built to move across borders that had never once slowed down the enemies chasing them. And it started with a number, 5,000. Follow the weapons and you start to see exactly how far this alliance's reach has spread. Turkey moved first and moved smart. Its defense industry, especially its drone program, pushed into the African market early, offering something few other suppliers could match: real capability at a fraction of the cost of comparable Western or Israeli systems. The Bayraktar TB2, the larger, more powerful Akinci. These drones didn't just arrive, they became the backbone of the entire alliance's air power. Mali received Akinci drones in December 2024, adding to 8 TB2S already in its arsenal. Niger brought in 6 TB2S, 5 Karayel SU drones, and additional Aksonga systems. Burkina Faso took delivery of at least 6 TB2S and 2 Akinci drones, with deliveries stretching back as far as April 2022, when the first shipnets began arriving. By 2024, Turkey had become the single largest supplier of combat drones anywhere on the African continent. Then came China. Russia, consumed by its own war in Ukraine, found its export capacity for weapons stretched thin. Unable to supply Africa at the scale it once could, China filled that gap without hesitation. Between 2020 and 2024, it became the largest overall arms supplier to West Africa. And by 2024, it had overtaken Russia entirely as the top exporter of weapons to sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. Low cost, high volume, delivered without the political conditions that had locked these countries out of Western markets for years. And Russia never disappeared from the picture either. It remains, by most assessments, the AES's closest security partner, its Africa core deeply embedded in the region's evolving defense relationships, even as the specific terms of that cooperation continue to shift. Add Iran into the mix as well, and you get a rare picture in modern geopolitics. 4 major global powers: China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, all competing for influence and partnership inside the very same alliance at the very same time. This is what it looks like when a region stops waiting for one single patron and instead builds relationships with anyone willing to show up as an actual partner. But this rise did not come without devastating cost. On April 25, 2026, in the opening days of a major Malian offensive, General Sadio Camara, Mali's Minister of Defense and Veterans Affairs, was killed in a car bomb attack at his home in Kati, just outside Bamako. The same weekend brought one of the most severe coordinated assaults the country had experienced in over a decade, carried out by militant groups aligned with Al-Qaeda alongside Tuareg separatist allies. The man who had spent years rebuilding Mali's military from almost nothing. The man behind the motorcycle rapid response units. The architect of the pivot toward China, Russia, and Turkey that had armed an entire alliance. gone. On April 30th, Bamako held a state funeral. Thousands gathered at the Military Engineering Battalion's grounds. President Assimi Goïta stood before Camara's coffin, draped in Mali's green, yellow and red, and bowed. Also present, Prime Minister Abdourahamane Tchiani and senior figures from Russia's military presence in the country. A visible marker of just how deep the partnership Camara had built had actually become. Days later, on May 4th, Goïta made a decision that spoke to how deeply this loss was felt at the highest level of Malian leadership. He appointed himself Minister of Defense, not a placeholder, not a caretaker, brought in from outside. The president himself stepping directly into the role his closest friend and longtime comrade had built and defended with his life. The message was unmistakable. The mission Camara died advancing was not going to pause, and it was not going to be handed to anyone less committed to finishing it. Because remember what this offensive was targeting in the first place. Not a symbolic strike, a coordinated assault, timed precisely at the moment Mali's military was moving to reclaim contested ground. The insurgency understood exactly what Camara represented, and exactly what losing him might cost the alliance's momentum. They were wrong, because 3 weeks after the funeral, the joint AES force wasn't retreating. It wasn't renegotiating its ambitions downward. It was still on track toward 15,000 troops, still expanding, still training with local instructors who had learned directly from the man who had just been laid to rest. Sadio Camara did not live to see the 15,000 troop force fully realized. But every soldier moving through that alliance today is moving through a structure he helped build with his own hands, refusing to let a foreign power tell his country how to defend itself. And that refusal is exactly where this story is heading next. Step back now and look at the full shape of what's actually been built here. 3 countries ranked not long ago among the most dangerous places on the planet to live, locked out of Western arms markets, suspended from ECOWAS, sidelined by the African Union, left by every conventional measure, without a path forward. And instead of collapsing under that pressure, they built an army, not 3 separate isolated forces struggling alone behind their own borders. One alliance, one command structure headquartered in Niamey, one rapidly growing joint force that went from 5,000 troops in December 2025 to 15,000 by April 2026, in less time than it takes most defense ministries anywhere in the world to finalize a single procurement contract. Trained by their own people, armed through partnerships they negotiated on their own terms, operating across the exact border regions, the Liptako-Gurma zone, where insurgents had spent over a decade moving freely while national armies stood still, boxed in by lines on a map drawn by people who never lived on this land. The chiefs of army staff from all 3 nations met in Ouagadougou in April 2026 to push this coordination even further, reinforcing a single unmistakable direction. This alliance isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. And underneath the troop numbers sits something just as significant: a financing model built to match the ambition. Patriotic support funds raised domestically, fueling a military buildup that doesn't depend on foreign aid packages that can be frozen the moment a foreign capital disapproves of a decision made in Bamako, Niamey or Ouagadougou. This is happening alongside deeper conversations about regional integration entirely. Talk of a shared currency, a joint central bank, a confederation moving towards something far more permanent than a temporary security pact. The military buildup isn't a standalone story. It's the clearest, hardest evidence yet that this alliance intends to stay. Now, here's the honest question worth sitting with, because a story this significant deserves more than a highlight reel. Will this model actually succeed where previous regional security efforts like the G5 Sahel framework ultimately fell short? Nobody outside this alliance can answer that with certainty yet. Building a 15,000-strong joint force is one enormous achievement. Sustaining it, funding it for years, keeping 3 sovereign nations moving in lockstep through every future political shift, that is a different challenge entirely, and one still being written in real time. But look at what's already undeniable. For years, the world watched African security discussions play out the same way. Statements from regional blocs, promises of coordinations, summits that produced declarations instead of deployments, The AES didn't wait for that process to finally deliver results. It built the force itself, and in doing so, it forced a question that neither ECOWAS nor the African Union can comfortably avoid any longer. If a young alliance of 3 nations, working with a fraction of the continent's total resources, can stand up a functioning joint military force in under 18 months, what exactly has been holding everyone else back? This is bigger than 3 countries defending their own territory, as important as that mission is on its own. This is a demonstration, a working model, proof that African-led security, built on African terms, trained by African instructors, funded through African resources, is not a distant aspiration. It is already operational right now, moving across borders that used to be nothing but open highways for the enemies chasing these nations for over a decade. The cost of getting here has been real, and it should never be minimized. Soldiers who trained with wooden rifles because the system was never built to protect them properly in the first place. A defense minister who gave his life defending the very sovereignty he spent years building. Communities across 3 nations who lived for years under threats no army was equipped to answer. But look at where that road has led. From wooden guns to a 15,000-strong multinational force with its own drones, its own command structure, and its own doctrine, built and taught by its own people. The age of waiting for someone else to solve Africa's security problems is coming to an end in this region, not through a speech, but through soldiers standing at a border they now control together. The Sahel is awake, and for the first time in a very long time, it is standing on ground it built for itself.